I never thought a Tuesday morning coffee on my own front porch would end with police sirens and a grown woman screaming that I was a criminal. But that's exactly what happened the day Patricia Hendricks decided I was her problem to solve. My name's Michael Torres, and I'd lived in my modest two-story house on Willow Creek Lane for nearly 8 months before the HOA discovered I existed. I'm a landscape architect who works mostly from home, and I'd specifically chosen this property because it sat just outside the boundaries of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The house had been built in the 1960s, long before the surrounding neighborhood was developed, and the previous owner had been an elderly widower who'd lived there for 43 years. When I bought the place, my attorney and I verified multiple times that the property was not part of any HOA. I wasn't interested in someone else dictating what color I could paint my shutters or whether my grass was exactly 2¼ inches tall. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, the kind of place where people walked their dogs at sunset and waved to each other. The HOA properties surrounded mine on 3 sides, but there was a clear property line marked by the original survey stakes and a subtle change in fencing style. My land was actually slightly elevated, sitting on what had once been a small hill before the developers leveled the surrounding lots. It gave me a nice view and, as I'd later discover, a very important legal advantage. For those first 8 months, I was invisible. I kept to myself, maintained my property beautifully because that's literally what I do for a living, and bothered no one. My lawn was immaculate, my garden beds were magazine-worthy, and my house was freshly painted in a tasteful sage green with cream trim. I didn't have any vehicles on blocks, no overgrown weeds, nothing that would catch anyone's attention. I was the neighbor everyone wants and nobody notices. Then Patricia Hendricks noticed me. I first saw her on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was sitting on my front porch with my coffee, reviewing some design plans for a client, when a silver Lexus SUV pulled into my driveway without invitation. The door opened and out stepped a woman in her mid-50s wearing pressed khaki pants, a white polo shirt with an embroidered logo I couldn't quite make out, and an expression that suggested she'd just discovered a violation of the natural order. She marched up my walkway with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her heels clicking against the concrete with military precision. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly I wondered if it was giving her a headache, and her lipstick was a shade of coral that matched her manicured nails exactly. "Excuse me," she called out, not waiting to reach the porch before starting her interrogation. "Are you the new resident of 847 Willow Creek Lane?" I set down my coffee and stood, trying to be neighborly despite the intrusion. "I am Michael Torres. Can I help you with something?" She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, her eyes scanning my property with an expression that somehow managed to be both dismissive and intensely focused. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I've received several complaints about this property." That was my first warning sign. Complaints? About what? I felt my jaw tighten but kept my voice even. Complaints about what, exactly? Patricia glanced down at her clipboard, flipping through what appeared to be several pages of notes. "Let's see. Your mailbox doesn't conform to the approved styles outlined in Section 4.2 of the HOA guidelines. Your exterior paint color was never submitted for approval. You have decorative items in your front yard that violate the landscaping ordinances. And your garbage cans were visible from the street last Thursday, which is a direct violation of Section 7.8. I stared at her for a long moment, processing the absurdity of what I was hearing. "Mrs. Hendricks, I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm not part of your HOA. This property isn't within your jurisdiction." Her expression shifted from businesslike to something colder. "Excuse me? This house was built before your development existed," I explained, keeping my tone patient and professional. "It's not part of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. The property boundaries are clearly marked, and I verified everything with my attorney when I purchased the home. So while I appreciate your dedication to your community, none of those rules apply to me." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Patricia's face went through a fascinating transformation, from confusion to disbelief to something that looked disturbingly like rage. Her knuckles whitened on the clipboard, and I watched a small vein appear on her forehead. "That's impossible," she said, her voice tight. Every property on Willow Creek Lane is part of this HOA. You must be mistaken. I'm not mistaken. I have the surveys and title documents if you'd like to verify. She took a step closer to the porch, and I noticed her hand was trembling slightly. Mr. Torres, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but trying to skirt HOA regulations is a serious matter. You will receive a formal notice of violation within 48 hours, and if you don't come into compliance, you'll face fines starting at $100 per day, per violation. I felt my own patience starting to wear thin. You can't find me. I'm not in your HOA. This isn't complicated. We'll see about that, she snapped, turning on her heel and marching back to her Lexus. She paused before getting in, looking back at me with an expression I'd later described to my attorney as menacing. You should know that I take my responsibilities as HOA president very seriously, Mr. Torres. This community has standards, and everyone needs to follow them. Everyone. She drove off, leaving me standing on my porch wondering what exactly I just stumbled into. The formal notice arrived exactly 48 hours later, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole thing. It was a thick packet of papers outlining every supposed violation Patricia had mentioned, plus several new ones she must have invented while staring at my property through binoculars. According to the notice, I owed $2,400 in fines and had 10 days to remedy all violations or face legal action. I called my attorney, Rebecca Chin, who'd handled my home purchase. She laughed when I explained the situation, but her tone turned serious when I read her some of the threats in the notice. Michael, this is harassment, she said. But here's what we're going to do. I'll draft a formal response with copies of all your property documents, surveys, and the title insurance policy that clearly shows you're not part of any HOA. That should end it. Should have ended it. Rebecca sent the documents via certified mail. Patricia Hendricks signed for them. And then she escalated. 2 days later, I came home from a client meeting to find an official-looking notice taped to my front door. It claimed that my property was under investigation for code violations, and that I was required to appear at an emergency HOA board meeting to address my noncompliance. The meeting was scheduled for that Friday at 7 p.m. in the community center clubhouse. I texted Rebecca a photo of the notice. Her response was immediate. Don't go. This is theater. They have no authority over you. But I was curious. And maybe a little annoyed. So Friday evening, I walked over to the community center, a modern building with glass walls and tasteful landscaping that I'd actually admired when I first moved in. Inside, about 30 residents sat in folding chairs facing a long table where Patricia held court with 4 other board members. She saw me the moment I walked in, and her eyes lit up like she just won a prize. Mr. Torres, she announced loudly, silencing the murmuring crowd. How gracious of you to join us. Please, come sit in the front row. We have quite a bit to discuss regarding your property. I sat down, very aware that every eye in the room was now on me. Patricia shuffled her papers with theatrical precision, then launched into what I can only describe as a performance. She detailed every supposed violation, complete with photographs she'd apparently taken from the street. She talked about community standards, and property values, and the social contract we all share as neighbors. She made it sound like my sage greenhouse was a blight on civilization itself. When she finally paused for breath, I raised my hand. Yes, Mr. Torres? Her voice dripped with false courtesy. Mrs. Hendricks, as I explained before and as my attorney has documented extensively, I'm not part of this HOA. This entire meeting is pointless. The room erupted in whispers. Patricia's face flushed red. Mr. Torres, your attitude is exactly the problem here. You seem to think you're above the rules that govern this community. No, I said calmly, I'm just not subject to them. There's a difference. She slammed her hand on the table, and the room went silent. We'll see what the authorities have to say about that. The authorities showed up at my house the following Monday morning. I was in my home office, working on a planting design for a corporate campus, when I heard the knock. Loud, official, unmistakable. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable. Michael Torres? The older officer asked. He had graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much nonsense in his career. That's me. What's this about? We received a complaint from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Something about property violations and refusing to comply with community regulations. They're claiming you're creating a nuisance and disturbing the peace. I felt anger flash through me, hot and sharp, but I kept my voice level. Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. May I show you some documents? The younger officer, who couldn't have been more than 25, nodded. That would be helpful, sir. I invited them in and pulled out the folder Rebecca had prepared for me. Inside were the property surveys, the title documents, the deed, the title insurance policy, and Rebecca's formal letter to the HOA with all the supporting evidence. The older officer, whose name tag read Morrison, put on reading glasses and went through everything methodically while his partner waited. After about 5 minutes, Morrison looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mr. Torres, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you know exactly where your property lines are? Like, precisely? Yes. They're marked on the survey. The stakes are still there if you want to see them. Morrison exchanged a glance with his partner. Show us. We walked outside, and I led them around my property. The original survey stakes were still visible, old iron posts that had been there for decades. I showed them the northern boundary, which ran along the sidewalk. The eastern boundary, which separated my land from the neighbor's fence. The southern boundary, which curved slightly and included a small section of what I'd always assumed was just grass between properties. Morrison pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Then he made a call. Yeah, it's Morrison. I'm at 847 Willow Creek Lane. Can you pull up the plat maps for this area? Specifically, Lot 847 and the Willow Creek Estates development. He listened for a moment, then said, No, I'm serious. Pull them up now. We stood there in awkward silence for about 3 minutes until Morrison's phone rang. He answered, listened, and I watched his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. You're absolutely sure? Another pause. No, that's exactly what I needed to know. Thanks. He hung up and looked at me with something that might have been respect. Mr. Torres, do you know what's built on that southern section of your property? I glanced over at the area he was indicating. It was just grass and a sidewalk. Nothing? It's just part of the lot. That's the Willow Creek Estates community mailbox station. And about 30 feet of the main entrance road where it curves into the development. They're on your land. The world seemed to tilt slightly. What? The younger officer pulled out his own phone, apparently looking at something the station had sent. According to the county records, when the development was built in 1985, the construction company purchased an easement from the previous owner of your property for road access. But that easement expired after 20 years, in 2005. No one ever renewed it. Morrison nodded slowly. Which means the HOA, and everyone using that entrance, has been technically trespassing on your property for the last 20 years. I stood there, trying to process this information. The main entrance to Willow Creek Estates, the one with the fancy stone pillars and the neighborhood sign, the one that at least 200 residents used every single day, was on my land. The mailbox station where they all collected their mail was on my land. So when Mrs. Hendricks was standing in my driveway, I said slowly, threatening to fine me and force me to comply with her rules. She was standing on your property, threatening you while you were completely within your rights, Morrison finished. Yeah. That's about the size of it. The younger officer was grinning now. Oh man, this is going to be awkward for them. Morrison shot him a look but couldn't quite hide his own amusement. Mr. Torres, here's what's going to happen. We're going to file a report that states there's no violation on your part and that the complaint was without merit. We're also going to have to notify the HOA board that they need to address the property issue with you, probably through their attorneys. In the meantime, if Mrs. Hendricks or anyone from the HOA harasses you again, you call us immediately. That would be actual harassment, and we take that seriously. I thanked them and they left. I stood in my driveway for a long moment, looking at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, at the stone pillars that were apparently on my land, at the mailboxes that were definitely on my land. Then I called Rebecca. Rebecca, you're not going to believe this. After I explained everything, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Michael, we need to verify this independently, but if what the police told you is accurate, you have significant leverage here. The HOA has been using your property without permission or compensation for 2 decades. You could demand they stop, you could negotiate a new easement, or you could sell them the land. But first, let's confirm everything. It took 3 days for Rebecca to get all the documentation from the county, the original easement agreement, and the surveys that proved beyond any doubt that yes, the main entrance to Willow Creek Estates was on my property. She scheduled a meeting with the HOA board and their attorney for the following Tuesday. I'll never forget walking into that community center conference room. The entire board was there, including Patricia, who looked like she'd aged 5 years in a week. Their attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Kenneth Briggs, sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents that I assumed matched what Rebecca had compiled. Patricia wouldn't make eye contact with me. She stared at her hands, her perfectly manicured nails now bitten down to nothing. Rebecca laid out the facts calmly and professionally. The expired easement. The 20 years of unpermitted use. The photographs I'd taken showing exactly where my property lines intersected with their infrastructure. The police report confirming the trespass. She spoke for about 15 minutes, and the only sound in the room besides her voice was Patricia's shallow breathing. When Rebecca finished, Kenneth Briggs cleared his throat. Mr. Torres, Ms. Chin, on behalf of the Willow Creek Estates HOA board, I want to apologize for the confusion and the aggressive approach Mrs. Hendricks took. We had no idea about the property line situation. We've been operating under the assumption that the easement was perpetual. Assumptions don't hold up in court, Rebecca said pleasantly. Now, my client has been harassed, threatened with fines, had the police called on him, and been publicly embarrassed in front of the HOA membership. He would be well within his rights to pursue legal action. However, Mr. Torres is a reasonable man. He's willing to discuss options. Patricia finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. What do you want? Her voice was barely a whisper. I leaned forward. First, a formal written apology from the HOA board to be posted in the community newsletter and at the clubhouse. Second, all violations and fines against me are withdrawn and expunged from any records. Third, we negotiate a new easement agreement for the entrance and mailbox station at fair market value. Kenneth nodded immediately. Those terms are acceptable. We'll need to have the land appraised for the easement negotiation, but yes, we agree. Patricia made a small sound, almost like a sob. One of the other board members, a kind-looking older man I'd later learn was named George, reached over and patted her hand. Patricia, this is on all of us. We should have verified the property boundaries years ago. The apology appeared in the Willow Creek Estates newsletter the following week, taking up half a page. It was professionally written, probably by Kenneth Briggs, and it outlined the property situation while carefully avoiding making the HOA look completely incompetent. But the important part was there, a clear statement that I had been wrongly accused, that I was not and had never been subject to HOA regulations, and that the board apologized for any distress caused. Patricia Hendricks resigned as HOA president 3 days after the apology was published. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, which suddenly became very friendly to me, that the board had asked for her resignation after several members raised concerns about her handling of the situation. Apparently, I wasn't the first person she'd gone after with excessive zeal, just the first one who'd had the legal grounds to push back effectively. George, the kind older man from the meeting, took over as interim president. He came to my house personally a week later, without a clipboard or a Lexus or an attitude, just a plate of cookies his wife had baked and a genuine desire to make things right. Michael, he said as we sat on my porch, the same porch where Patricia had first confronted me, I want you to know that most of us aren't like Patricia. She meant well in her way. She just got caught up in the power of it all. Started seeing violations everywhere, started thinking the rules were more important than the people following them. I accepted a cookie. It was excellent, oatmeal with butterscotch chips. I understand. I don't want to be an enemy to the neighborhood. I just want to live my life in peace. And you should be able to, George said firmly. "We're going to make this right. Kenneth's getting the appraisals done this week, and we should have a fair offer for the easement within the month. The board has also voted to put some checks on the president's authority going forward. No more one-person show." The easement negotiation took 6 weeks total. Rebecca handled most of it, and I ended up with a very fair price for a perpetual easement that allowed the HOA to maintain the entrance road and mailbox station on my property. The payment was enough to completely redo my kitchen and add a home office extension. More importantly, the agreement included specific language stating that I was not now, nor would I ever be, subject to HOA regulations. Patricia, I heard, moved to a different neighborhood about 3 months after her resignation. I never saw her again, though I did hear from George that she'd sent a personal apology letter to him to forward to me. I never received it, and I didn't ask for it. Some things are better left alone. The neighborhood itself changed in subtle ways after everything settled. People who'd never waved before started stopping to chat when I was working in my garden. I was invited to neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties, always with the clarification that they were just neighbor get-togethers, not HOA events. I became something of a minor legend, the guy who'd stood up to the HOA and won, and while I hadn't been seeking that reputation, I couldn't deny it opened doors. More importantly, it taught me something I'd suspected but never fully appreciated. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about being difficult or confrontational. It's about knowing your rights and not letting someone else's authority complex steamroll you into submission. Patricia had been so certain of her power, so convinced that her clipboard and her rules gave her dominion over everyone in her line of sight, that she'd never bothered to verify the basic facts. She'd assumed, and that assumption had cost her. I think about that Tuesday morning sometimes, when I'm sitting on my porch with my coffee, looking out at the neighborhood that once tried to force me into compliance. I think about Patricia's face when she first confronted me, so sure of herself, so ready to enforce her will. And I think about her face in that conference room, when she realized that the land she'd been standing on, the entrance her entire community used, the authority she'd wielded so carelessly, all of it rested on my property, subject to my permission. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere about foundations and assumptions, about checking your facts before you throw your weight around, about the difference between power and authority. But mostly I just appreciate the quiet. The HOA leaves me alone now. The neighbors are friendly. My house is still sage green with cream trim, my mailbox is still the style I chose, and my garbage cans sit wherever I damn well please on Thursday nights. And every time I drive past those stone pillars at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, the ones that mark the gateway to their community but sit firmly on my land, I smile. Not out of spite, but out of satisfaction. Sometimes justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet vindication and the knowledge that you stood up for yourself when it mattered. The new HOA president, George, turned out to be exactly what the community needed. He ran things with common sense instead of power trips, focused on actual community building instead of violation hunting, and treated every resident, including me, with respect. Under his leadership, the neighborhood actually became the kind of place Patricia had claimed to be protecting, a real community instead of a dictatorship with landscaping requirements. I still work from home, still maintain my property beautifully because that's who I am, and still enjoy my coffee on the front porch every Tuesday morning. But now when cars pull into my driveway, they're friends or clients, not clipboard-wielding enforcers of imaginary authority. And that makes all the difference. The final irony, which George told me about months later over another plate of his wife's excellent cookies, was that Patricia had been so focused on my property violations that she'd missed several actual problems in the neighborhood. A house 2 streets over had been running an illegal rental operation in violation of actual HOA rules. Another property had a serious drainage issue that was causing problems for 3 neighboring homes. But Patricia had been too busy taking pictures of my mailbox to notice any of it. She was so focused on being right, George said, shaking his head, that she forgot to actually help anyone. That's not what an HOA is supposed to be about. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced down unreasonable authority or stood your ground when everyone told you to back down, I hope it reminded you that knowing your rights matters. Facts matter. Truth matters. I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to HOA Bright Reality, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of justice served and karma delivered. Because in a world where people like Patricia think they can intimidate their way to compliance, we need to remember that sometimes the quiet person with the property deed has the last word.